Almost 3 full years ago, Cyberpunk 2077 launched to a very, very mixed reception, especially if you were playing on Xbox One or PlayStation 4, where the game was barely functional in almost every possible respect. Terrible frame rates, a plague of glitches, it was just a mess from every angle. If you played on PC or were lucky enough to get your hands on an Xbox Series X or PlayStation 5 prior to the game's release, then you likely had a more tolerable time, at least in the frame rate department, as it ran at a pretty solid 60 FPS on the new machines. But unfortunately, the new technology at the time still wasn't enough to push away the endless torrent of bugs. I reviewed the game back then, and I didn't skimp on mentioning and showing a lot of the weird stuff I encountered. Some bugs were benign and actually kinda funny. Others were frustrating progress blockers. And this is before I even mentioned the fact that the game crashed back to my PS5's home screen a whopping 15 times throughout my first playthrough, averaging one crash every 3 to 3.5 hours. On top of that, the game had some odd gameplay quirks, like useless perks and life paths not being meaningful opening acts like we were told they would be. Instead, they were just 20-minute intros. CDPR is a very ambitious company, and as such, every game they make is grander in scope than the one before. And for the most part, they succeed at that growth, but that's after each game gets an adequate amount of post-release fixes. Sadly, the studio has a very unfortunate history of their games being broken on launch, and each game is more broken than the last and takes longer to fix. They hit the pinnacle of their persistent problem with Cyberpunk 2077's disastrous opening, which was so bad that Sony forcefully removed the game from the PlayStation Store because they were sick of all the refunds people were demanding. The silver lining is that the game was still immensely successful financially, selling over 13 million units by the end of December 2020. The hype machine was that powerful. However, in spite of that success, the damage to the studio's reputation was already done. Management was under fire from every direction, and some seasoned employees would quit to form their own new studios. It was a sad state of affairs. But in the face of these troubles, CDPR remained steadfast and stated that they were fully committed to improving the game and making additional content for it. Credit where credit is due, they were true to their word, which is something that other companies of comparable size can't bother to be. I ended my old review by saying that I was going to keep the game installed in case it received big, meaningful updates and patches, and it did. But they came out so slowly that I never really felt compelled to actually go back to the game. So I ended up uninstalling it after several months of it collecting digital dust on my storage drive. Every once in a while since then, I would catch news of Cyberpunk 2077 updates, and they always did seem large and substantial. And a couple of them did give me a small itch to play that I briefly considered scratching. But what I was really interested in was the inevitable expansion the game would eventually receive. I knew it would get one sooner or later, and that would be where the biggest changes would happen. So, I locked Cyberpunk away into the deepest pits of my mind and basically forgot about it until the reveal of Phantom Liberty, the one and only expansion CDPR plans on giving the game. This was my signal to become interested again. This was the big neon sign telling me that if I'm gonna give this game a second chance, it's gonna be when this expansion is out. The studio spared no expense in telling us how big it was going to be, not just in terms of story, but also regarding deep, impactful gameplay changes. The green light to become excited again went off, and as you might assume, I was very cautiously optimistic, but optimistic nonetheless. But now, Phantom Liberty and the long-awaited 2.0 update are out. I made an entirely new save file and played through it all again, hence why it's taken so long for this review to come out, plus juggling several other games. And now it's time to talk about it. So let's finish this long introduction and finally dive into the review. Let's first discuss the massive 2.0 update and the biggest changes it brings to the table. I figure it would be best to cover this now since some people might want to buy and play the base game before committing to purchasing the Phantom Liberty expansion, which is completely fair. First, the skill tree. Skills in 2.0 are possibly the single biggest change worth mentioning, not only because it improves on the old skill tree, but because the new one is stuffed with so many significant modifications that build variety is more diverse than ever. The old tree had some reasonable perks in it, mostly your standard stat boosts and speed increases. But it also had some remarkably useless shit in it. If I recall correctly, there used to be a perk called, I think, Commando, which made you undetectable underwater. Sounds useful at first, until you play through the game and realize it's not just possible, but in fact effortlessly easy to play all the way to the end credits without ever entering any body of water during combat at any point in the game. It was worthless, laughably so. But the new collection of perks is anything but. There's some crazy shit in here that dramatically changes gameplay and makes melee only and even fist only builds totally viable. You have perks under the cool attribute that heavily rewards stealth and pistol usage. The reflexes tree gives you massive bonuses for sword, SMG, and assault rifle builds, including big buffs for dashing and air dashing and deflecting bullets back at your enemies. The intelligence tree can turn you into a lethal hacker who will probably never even need to unholster a weapon, now that you can queue up multiple hacks on one target. And the body attribute can transform you into an unstoppable tank that can do area of effect ground slams with hammers. It's insane. The old skill tree let you feel strong at the end of the game, sure, but the new system is super rewarding and makes you feel like a one-man army no matter what combination of attributes you focus on. Different builds with different focuses will feel vastly different from one another now, and it's probably the game's strongest argument for multiple playthroughs. Next is vehicular combat. Back when Cyberpunk launched, vehicular combat was practically non-existent. I recall being able to stick your head out of the window and shoot a pistol, but I don't think it was even possible outside of scripted sequences where an NPC was driving the car anyway. But regardless, I can definitely tell the 2.0 system is an immense improvement. You can finally shoot and drive at the same time with ease, and the game has a very generous auto-aim so it's not too unwieldy. You can also shoot with either a pistol or submachine gun. It feels pretty good. On top of good control over being able to fire weapons yourself, there's also vehicles with guns mounted onto them. They're mostly on nomad vehicles you'd find out in the Badlands or on certain city-based gang cars. But weapon-mounted cars have either a machine gun on them or a rocket launcher, or maybe both. As you might assume, you can wreak some crazy havoc with the right vehicle. And speaking of havoc, the 2.0 update includes the very long-awaited police overhaul. This was a big complaint of mine back in the original review. If you watched any reviews of the game back then or played it yourself, you know that the police response system was total garbage. If you rack up a wanted level, cops would just spawn right next to you. And I mean right next to you. And they wouldn't chase you in a vehicle either, making them pathetically easy to escape. They just pop out of thin air and start blasting at you without even trying to defend themselves. It was the most pitiful police system I had ever seen in an open-world crime game before, and this was technology that was practically perfected back in the PS2 era. But those days are gone now, and Night City's boys in blue are a bigger threat than ever. When you gain a wanted level, they spawn further away and close in on your position, and they have vision cones that you can see on the minimap in the corner. The higher your wanted level, the more aggressively they spawn in the vicinity and hunt you down. If you're in a car, they'll actually chase and ram you, and if you're on foot, they'll try to surround you. They're actually functional now. And, as the cherry on top, if you really fuck stuff up and prove to be a real menace to society, they'll deploy their elite max tax squads to hunt you down, and these dudes are essentially boss fights. Now let's head over to Cyberware. Alongside the skill tree, this is probably the most interesting change in 2.0, depending on how you play. There's 2 new meters on each side of the Cyberware screen. To the left, there's Cyberware capacity, which denotes a point-based limit on how much Cyberware you have on you, and how strong they can be. Basically, when you first start the game, you'll only be able to equip lower tier stuff, and probably not even enough to have 1 piece for each body part, so you'll have to be frugal. However, as you level up and choose specific perks, you'll be able to dramatically increase your capacity and be chromed the fuck out from head to toe with the most powerful tools available. The other meter is armor. Since CDPR got rid of armor stats for clothes, thus making them cosmetic only, they've decided to move armor over to Cyberware. Certain types of Cyberware have an inherent armor rating, and depending on what you install, you'll be able to become quite tanky. Depending on your playstyle or build, these new parameters might enforce a change in approach, or maybe even open up new possibilities you might not have considered before the change. Finally, there's stamina changes. Prior to 2.0, stamina was drained by sprinting, jumping, and engaging in melee combat. Now, however, sprinting and jumping no longer affect it, and just plain old shooting will spend stamina instead. If you run out of stamina while spraying lead, your accuracy will drop. Thus, stamina is exclusively related to combat. This change might be irksome to a small group of players, but I can't really say it impacted me all that much in my own playthrough, and I tried to maintain a healthy mix of shooting and melee. That pretty much does it for all the major overhauls included in the 2.0 update, but there's other smaller stuff scattered around. The appearance of weapon attachments were reworked, car handling is way better, and there's some new radio stations. And now there's also a hard limit on how many healing items and grenades you can use in a single fight. It probably goes without saying, but 2.0 makes this game way smoother than it ever was. The last thing I want to touch on before moving on to the expansion is visuals. When I last played Cyberpunk, it was the PS4 version running on PS5, as I mentioned near the beginning of the video. Thankfully, this meant that the game ran at a solid 60 FPS out of the box, but beyond that, it was also just a good-looking game. Even though it wasn't a true PS5 version, it was clear that the game had some excellent art direction. The location of Night City was a sight to behold. It had character and it had detail, but unfortunately, all of that visual charisma was constantly slapped away by the bugs and crashes I kept running into. It really irritated me. I was annoyed that this amazing setting was being undermined by issues that shouldn't have existed in the first place, let alone exist this strongly. But with the 2.0 update, as well as every update preceding it, Night City is finally allowed to let loose and show the world its best self. I used my PS4 copy to obviously download a native PS5 version, and since I already played through the entire game at 60 FPS when it first launched, I thought I would just go ahead and take the performance hit and punch it down to 30 just so I could experience the hustle, bustle, and bloodshed of this neon dystopia in quality mode with ray tracing. I typically prefer playing games at 60, but if quality mode is enough of a difference and the gameplay isn't so fast-paced that 60 is almost mandatory, then I'm willing to switch over. And let me tell you, for this game, I don't regret it. Cyberpunk 2077 is now one of the most stylish and beautiful games you can play today, and that's just based on the PS5 version I'm experiencing. If you have a very beefy PC, your game will look even better with its insane path tracing capabilities. But even with the aging technology of this now 3-year-old console, the vibrant aesthetic is almost overwhelming. For the first dozen or so hours of playing, it was almost impossible to resist the urge to just walk everywhere instead of driving so I could take in the sights and soak up the vibe. The lighting, the textures, the density of the environmental assets and the variety of them, the weather, and even the ambient sounds of the city all coalesce into one of the most atmospheric settings ever made in video games. CDPR has already confirmed they're hard at work on a sequel to this game, and at this point, I highly look forward to it, if only to walk around an even bigger and badder Night City. Now obviously, I'm not the first person to point out how gorgeous the game is, but there is one related discussion here that I might as well touch on: the game's engine. CDPR has already confirmed that all projects from here on out will be developed on Unreal Engine, meaning they're leaving REDengine behind for good, and Cyberpunk 2077 will be its swan song. This is pretty unfortunate news because proprietary engines that stay within a company usually offer interesting strengths and weaknesses that can really shake up the flavor of a game. It's why I'm such a huge supporter and lover of Capcom's REengine, soon to be Rex Engine in the near future. But I can't say that I'm surprised by this move. As popular as CDPR's games have become over the years, they've also become more ambitious, and every time they release a game that's more ambitious than the last, it launches in a more broken state than the last as well. And it takes even longer to fix. Cyberpunk 2077 was probably the straw that broke the camel's back on that front. After the game's disastrous launch, I imagine that management took a long, hard look at their development pipeline and decided that it was best to avoid another horrible opening. And the ideal way to do that was to move to a popular, established AAA-friendly engine with lots of resources and maintained by a third party. Meaning, CDPR doesn't have to spend money and manpower constantly maintaining and updating their own engine anymore. All they have to do now is pay for licensing. Again, it's a shame that REDengine is being sacrificed for this greater sense of security, but I would be lying if I said I was shocked. All we can hope for now is that CDPR leverages the strengths of Unreal in such a manner that its weaknesses are not obvious and remind people that it's on Unreal. Because some games kinda do that. But only time will tell. If there's one thing that disappoints me, not so much about 2.0 but the game overall still, it's the fact that life path intros are still just glorified prologues. And I know at this point it isn't really fair to the game itself to keep complaining about this, because trying to expand them into new, huge first acts is basically an impossible task that would require making an entirely new game. I know that. It's not fair to hold this against the game when there's plenty of variety to be found in other aspects of the experience. But if there's one promise that was made during the hype building stage leading up to the game's initial release that I desperately wanted to be true, it was Life Path Beginnings being long and wildly different openings. I love RPGs with open and highly variable first acts, but unfortunately, even with the 2.0 update and Phantom Liberty, life paths still really aren't that. And it's not so much an issue with the game as it is the long-lasting effects of promises that weren't kept. No matter how much CDPR improved the game, nothing can actually go back in time and unmention the features they said they intended to give us, but didn't. It just goes to show how important expectation management is. As much as I'm enjoying the game now, it'll be difficult to not think about the what-ifs when I start a new playthrough. Maybe this is something the sequel will live up to, but we'll touch on that later. Now, let's finally head into the second subject of the video, Phantom Liberty, which is a hefty amount of new content in itself, coming in at about 15 to 20 hours worth of playtime to beat it at a decent pace, which is a pretty solid time for $30. The story of Phantom Liberty runs simultaneously with the base game story, which is obvious if you played the base game already. It begins with the main character, V, receiving a sudden but powerful voice message from an extremely strong netrunner, Songbird, who claims to know how to spare V from an early end by removing the relic in their head. However, in order to be given access to this method of survival, V has to take part in a mission involving the protection of the new United States of America's president, Rosalind Myers, from Kurt Hansen, the warlord who rules over the lawless district of Dogtown. After Myers' transport crashes within Dogtown's walls, V escorts her to safety, but in the process loses communication with Songbird, kicking off yet another mission to search for her while also dealing with Hansen and his forces. To accomplish this, they enlist the help of multiple allies, including sleeper agent Solomon Reed, played by none other than Idris Elba. If there's one all-encompassing thing to say about the cast of Phantom Liberty, it's that everyone knocked their performances out of the park, both major and supporting characters. They all emit strong personalities, and I don't think there's a weak link in the bunch. And that continues to be true for Cherami and Gavin, the voices of female and male V respectively. I know it's commonly stated that Cherami's performance is a bit stronger, but I don't think that should lead anyone towards ignoring Gavin, especially when you consider the fact that he's Irish and somehow manages to totally toss away his accent to sound like a perfect, grimy inner-city American punk. Idris Elba as Reed is about exactly what you'd expect. He's intimidating, efficient, and authoritative, not unlike several other roles Elba has already been in, from Stringer Bell in The Wire to Stacker Pentecost in Pacific Rim to John Luther. It's a type of character that he's very familiar with and fantastic at. As expected, Keanu Reeves also returns to continue lending his likeness and voice to the character of Johnny Silverhand, and it feels like he's a more active participant than ever. It's probably just the density of the content due to Phantom Liberty being an expansion, but it feels like Johnny, and Keanu by extension, has much more to say and more opportunities to interact with the player. I'm quite happy about that because, as much of a dick as he sometimes is, Johnny is a fascinating character, and I think Keanu did an excellent job as him. Another character worth mentioning is the district of Dogtown itself. Even though it's nestled right in the middle of southern Night City, Dogtown manages to have its own distinct visual personality, specifically by looking a hell of a lot shittier than the rest of the city. Dogtown is so run down, you would think that you entered a settlement in Fallout. The place makes its neighbor Pacifica look like some utopian heaven. There's a real griminess to it that really highlights how much worse things are within its walls than beyond them. Unless, of course, you happen to be one of the wealthier residents who runs things behind the scenes, pulling political strings on the path to simply seizing more power. Dogtown is the worst of Night City, but condensed and amplified, though not without its charms. It even has its own militia, called the Barghest, run by Kurt Hansen. One major characteristic of Dogtown, though, is how huge it feels. It's only one district and takes up maybe 1/10 of the proper city area, not including the Badlands, but CDPR structures the district in a way that makes it feel gigantic, particularly by having you on your feet more often than in a car, and by adding a lot of walkways and verticality. There is one observation I made about Phantom Liberty, specifically regarding when you're supposed to play it. Judging solely from how other characters in the expansion talk to you, it seems like the plot happens when V hasn't fully made a reputation for themselves yet, which leads me to believe that the intention is for the player to start playing the content near the halfway point of the game, not too long after it becomes initially available. If you start playing Phantom Liberty when you're already at the ass end of the main story, it might be a little jarring to hear Johnny suddenly act slightly more cold, or to hear others refer to you as someone small time. This isn't a criticism, just an observation for those who want maximum immersion. Phantom Liberty also introduces some new ways to interact with the world. First is airdrops, which is a periodic dynamic activity that pops up in Dogtown. Basically, a group of Barghest goons sit and guard an airdropped cache of high-level equipment and items, and it's up to you to decide if you want to take it for yourself. It can be quite rewarding as the caches contain a pretty generous amount of goods, and you don't even get any wanted levels for absolutely destroying the patrol protecting it. Second is car hijacking missions, another dynamic activity where you're occasionally pinged for a special vehicle in your immediate vicinity to steal and bring back to the fixer El Capitan Reyes. But it's not as simple as just driving over to his garage. You'll also have pursuers come after you, and you'll need to either kill them or escape them before you can safely deliver the vehicle. Both of these types of new open-world dynamic missions are great ways to take a short break from the story and get some extra scratch in your pocket. But that's on top of the new collection of side missions and gigs offered by the expansion. One thing that this new content does excellently is making your choices matter in the side missions. In some of them, your actions dramatically impact the rewards you receive and the outcome of the people you help. If you're not careful, your decisions could turn your client into a corpse. You can also run into them out in the open world later once you're ready to go back to the greater Night City. Furthermore, some missions even offer optional objectives that ask for the involvement of friends you made in the base game, which is awesome because it ensures that major support characters stay relevant to your adventure. After all, you might be in Dogtown, but you are still in Night City. It's not like you're on the opposite side of the country. It wouldn't make much sense for your friends to just basically drop off the face of the earth just because you began Phantom Liberty. Granted, their involvement is pretty much limited to just text, but talking to them can majorly alter the course of the mission, sometimes cutting it short by 50% or more. The lack of impact that choices had was something I criticized back in my initial review of the base game. But with this revisit, I'm starting to suspect that it might have been the result of my first character having a corpo life path, as I've chosen a street kid life path for this second one, and I feel like I see way more helpful new choices and prompts pop up than I remember. Also, there's one mission in particular that's really amazing. It's a long one, but the best part involves a swanky party loaded with people, and running into various familiar faces and voices you've either met on your adventure so far, or heard on TV or the radio. It's got an amazing vibe. Without going into too much detail, there's also a surprising number of ways to end the central plot of Phantom Liberty as well, including some that unlock a completely new ending for the base game, and it's a very bittersweet ending that totally alters the future of V. And even beyond all of that, Phantom Liberty obviously offers stuff like new weapons, vehicles, and clothes too. Oh, and one thing I really appreciate regarding clothes is the fact that they no longer have stats themselves, and there's a glamour or transmog system so you can keep benefits from specific articles of clothing while still rocking an outfit you actually like. I believe this was added in an earlier patch, but as I said, I didn't play the game during earlier patches. It just went from launch to 2.0. Either way, I am thankful for the addition. Another thing I appreciate is CDPR adding more small ways to talk to friends, and especially romances. Romantic partners now send flavor texts more often, as well as the occasional selfie, and that's really cool. It helps them feel more like real people, which is a big deal because one of the worst things games do when it comes to romance is turn your partner into another NPC that repeats the same few lines of dialogue over and over again once you've successfully courted them. Sadly, Cyberpunk still kinda does this, but it's not as egregious now as it was on launch. I just wish romances weren't so divorced from the main game. I would honestly like to talk to my partner and my other friends about missions I go on and get their input. Phantom Liberty somewhat offers this and allows you to call up your friends and tell them that you worked for the president, but it's extremely brief and they don't seem to believe you. Not that I blame them. Cyberpunk 2077 has taken a lot of positive and impactful strides in boosting the game's immersiveness, but this is still a bit of a weak spot. I'm not too critical about it, partly because I'm aware that this is maybe yet another result of being spoiled by Baldur's Gate 3, a game which helps its romance mechanics by being a party-based game anyway, where all of your potential partners are traveling and fighting at your side the entire time. So I'll cut Cyberpunk some slack and just say that I hope the sequel makes some improvements on this front. Also, and this is just me being selfish, but I kinda wish Phantom Liberty had some romanceable characters too. Let's just say I had no idea French redheads with dark lipstick had such a hold on me until I played this expansion. Speaking of the sequel though, I do have high hopes for it now that CDPR has managed to stick to their guns and dramatically improve Cyberpunk 2077 to the point where it actually feels like a totally different game. They've already stated that the sequel is underway and currently in the conception stage, as of early October. However, one thing that has me excited is they've also committed to making the sequel bigger than the first game. They want every new game to offer more than the last, just as they did with the Witcher trilogy. That's quite the promise to make, because if you've played the Witcher games in order, then you know exactly how much bigger and more ambitious each one is than the last. The Wild Hunt plus its own expansions is a gigantic 100 to 120 hour commitment. I think this desire to grow also plays into their decision to move from the REDengine to Unreal. Cyberpunk, even on day one, despite all of its bugs, was obviously still a big game, boasting about 50 to 60 hours of content. And it's even bigger now that Phantom Liberty is out. If CDPR wants to release an even more ambitious sequel in a timely manner, and preferably without an utterly broken experience on launch, then moving to a big AAA third-party engine that's super streamlined like Unreal is probably a good move for them in the long run, despite how promising REDengine is. Of course, we have to wait for the game to actually come out before we know that for sure. But after how many positive changes 2077 has gone through since 2020, I'm actually feeling quite optimistic again, and I never thought that would happen. The 2.0 update and Phantom Liberty come together to overhaul the Cyberpunk 2077 experience so immensely it almost feels like its own sequel in terms of mechanics and overall feel. But with the major changes to things like NPC and police AI, enemy AI, build variety, graphical upgrades, and impactful choices, the game that was so busted back in late 2020 and getting by almost purely on potential is now just about fully realized in relation to that potential it first displayed. It took 3 years, but Cyberpunk is, more or less, finally the game I wished it was. It's fun, it's engrossing, it's gorgeous, and there's a dramatic decrease in the amount of crashes and glitches that harm my experience. As of writing this review, I have about 50 hours of playtime with my new character, and I've crashed twice in the first several hours, but haven't seen any weird bugs that were bizarre enough for me to record. I must give CDPR credit. It was a long and expensive task to fix this game. So long and expensive that if other big publishers had made this game, they probably would have just taken that launch window money and ran straight to the development of the sequel. At best, they might have fixed the worst glitches and performance issues, but they wouldn't have dedicated themselves to massive overhauls that took months of hard work. The industry is rife with cheapskates like that. So I respect CDPR for digging in their heels, rolling up their sleeves, and putting the effort in to make this game the shining beacon it should have been. It would have been such an incredible waste of the Cyberpunk IP if this game was left in the condition it was in when it first launched. But now, I look forward to the future of this series, and that's not something I would have said immediately after finishing the base game on week 1. But my optimism has finally been restored, and I look forward to revisiting this neon-drenched dystopia in the future. This concludes my review of Cyberpunk 2077's 2.0 update and Phantom Liberty expansion. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.
What are you gonna do? Cross your legs and meditate till they drop dead?
Wish you dropped dead.